Hello everyone, this is Professor Reha, Chief Information Officer of Clan Indigo Oni, here with the final part of the Kilo report. This particular report will be discussing how I specifically build the Kilo for various modes and situations. I will be detailing some minor variations here, which I won't necessarily show you screenshots of because I can describe the idea to you and you can figure out what I'm talking about without necessarily me needing to throw up another screenshot that you have to look at, so that way you can spend as much time listening and as little time actually seeing. With that out of the way, we're going to hop right into the one that probably the most number of people are going to be interested in, which is the Warzone build that I also use for Ground War. And I'm going to actually attach an asterisk to this particular statement because I actually only use this particular build for squad play, be it duos, trios, or quads. I don't use this particular setup when I solo in Warzone. I'll detail why I don't later on. But for squad war zones and ground war, this is what I play. Now, the 100 round drum was a very deliberate and specific choice because, of course, about 80 of your rounds, the last 80 of your rounds, are going to be roughly virtually recoilless. So that's a huge benefit for sustained fire situations, which Ground War and Warzone both present more than any other mode. And quite frankly, this is a big reason why I think the Kilo is best in Ground War and in Warzone. It's definitely one of my favorite assault rifles to take into these modes for that reason. However, the 100 round drum, as wonderful as it is for both of those modes in dealing with the large amount of enemies in Ground War or large amounts of health/armor in Warzone, it does weigh the gun down considerably, so no stock had to be attached to maintain ADS and move speed. Now, of course, no stock has a problem dropping recoil control, but it does have the happy side effect of boosting hipfire accuracy, which is fairly interesting and significant for how I ultimately wound up arriving at this build through some thorough testing. Now, you'll notice that I'm talking about testing and specific components first. That is because when I looked at what each mode required of me as a player, I looked at the Kilo, played with the Kilo for a while, and asked myself, what do I need out of the Kilo to perform at this particular mode better? So when I was thinking about Ground War, which is one of my favorite modes by the way, in Warzone, I knew instantly that I would want the 100 round drum for both the recoil control, as I said earlier, the virtual recoillessness of the last 80 rounds. No, that is not a word, I just invented it, you're welcome. And of course, no stock became a very natural second pick to counteract the 100 round drum, but now I needed something to counteract the drop in recoil, since testing showed that the no stock's drop in recoil was enough to really hurt the Kilo's distance firing. So the Mark IV grip became the choice. Now the reason why I use the Mark IV grip here very specifically rather than, say, the compensator, which is an acceptable substitute, is primarily because the Mark IV grip also further increases hipfire accuracy, and that's really helpful with SMGs and against even shotguns occasionally, because at the very least in Warzone, with all of that extra health you get from the armor, you actually stand a pretty decent chance of beating an SMG, because as weak as the Kilo's damage output is, it generally tends to be a little bit better than that of most SMGs. It becomes a question of accuracy and fire rate. How many bullets are you spitting out and how accurate are they? So since the Kilo fires pretty slowly, it has to compensate for this by being unusually accurate in the hipfire. And while it will never beat a shotgun or a specifically spec'd SMG, it will actually beat out a large quantity of other assault rifles and badly spec'd SMGs in close quarters combat situations. If you prefer to avoid close quarters combat, or you just don't like to do so at all, or you just simply don't like the Mark IV grip for whatever reason, the compensator is an acceptable substitute here. That does have a damaging effect on your aiming stability a little bit, whereas the Mark IV grip doesn't, which is another reason why I chose the Mark IV grip. But ultimately, that's a relatively minor problem with the tac laser, which increases your aiming stability and ADS speed more importantly. Now, the tac laser I did wind up ultimately picking when I decided I needed an optic for the Kilo, and obviously for Ground War and Warzone with such large distances, some kind of optic is recommended. And the reason why I went with the Scout Combat Optic rather than, say, the Sniper Scope is partially a matter of personal comfort, and partially a matter of it took too much aiming stability that I could fit on the gun with the 100 round drums and the no stock than I could afford to work with the sniper rifle. So the sniper rifle just demanded too much of the gun that I was already building. So I ultimately finalized the Scout Combat optic. It's one of my favorite optics, so there is a little bit of bias here towards that. Use whatever optic you're most comfortable with, but keep in mind that if you go to the 4 and above zoom range, you're going to have a problem with aiming stability, since the build as it's set up currently doesn't really support that very well. You could swap the Mark IV grip with the Commando foregrip, which also works very well with this particular build. You do sacrifice a little bit of your movement speed and your ability to hip fire, but it is an acceptable attachment, and if you use the Commando foregrip in conjunction with a longer range scope, that's perfectly acceptable. Now, some of you may be concerned about the TAC laser giving away your position, but both Ground War and Warzone have a large quantity of outdoor locations that make seeing the TAC laser very difficult. Sunlight generally makes lasers difficult to see, and that is perfectly true of the TAC laser. It only really gives you away in buildings, but the increased hip fire you get from the no-stock and Mark IV grip attachments really translates into you not really needing to aim down sights in a building anyways, for the most part. There are a couple of exceptions, like the TV station for instance, that do in fact require a certain amount of aiming down sights if you're in the right room. The hospital also comes to mind as a location where you may be shooting indoors while aiming down sights. But those particular buildings are easy enough to avoid if you are willing to just make that little bit of extra effort to stay out of the larger buildings. Most of the other buildings you can work just fine with hip firing at those particular ranges with, say, the smaller buildings. Now, I'm going to address something really quick before I move off of this build and explain why I don't extend the barrel or put a silencer on the Kilo build here. The primary reason I don't extend the barrel is because, honestly, you don't really need it with the Kilo. The Kilo already has relatively low damage output, and yes, extending the range does increase the damage you do at specific ranges. But in all honesty, a lot of the time when you first see somebody and you start shooting at them, they're going to be classified as long range anyways, since the Kilo's default medium range runs from 30 to 55 meters, roughly speaking. It's not that huge of a distance, and extending the barrel only increases that range by approximately 20-ish% depending on the barrel you're using. It's going to be a little more, a little less, but 20% is roughly speaking how much that increases, and that's just not a big increase. 20% of 55 is only roughly 12 meters, so you're only going out to about 63-ish meters, considering it's 54.5 for the actual 20%, which is just my approximation because I'm not gonna skip. I have an Excel spreadsheet with both stats on them, but it doesn't really make a difference for Warzone. Most of the time you're out of range anyways, so extending the range is a fairly silly prospect, especially since it decreases your ADS speed, and the Kilo needs to start shooting first. If you start shooting second with the Kilo, you probably have already lost. The 100 round drum I would much rather have because I've found that the extra ammo I get out of that, the extra 40 bullets over, say, the comparative 60 rounds, does really save my life or an ally's life in squads or in ground war. In fact, I have once been able to take out some 13, 14 people in a row coming out of a building on one of the ground war maps, and there was just no problem with it, and I died when I reloaded, of course, because ground war. But it's more useful to have the 100 round drum in both of those modes than an extended barrel. There are going to be people that disagree with me, that's fine. For the Kilo, I will stick by this statement. You don't really need to extend the barrel on the Kilo, it's just not necessary. Once you start shooting for long enough, you basically don't have recoil anymore, so there's just really no need to extend the range when your shots are going to be more accurate and you're going to be hitting the head more consistently anyways, which is far more useful than slapping on a extended barrel and losing a bunch of medium to close range fights because you can't aim down sights fast enough, or it kills your hipfire accuracy so much that any weenie SMG or even a pistol could beat you out in a hipfiring contest. It's just not something you want to have happen. So that is why I choose not to extend the barrel on this build. The reason why I don't use a silencer, and I'm going to put an addendum to this statement later, is the fact that unless your squad has agreed ahead of time to go quiet, somebody on your squad is either using an unsilenced weapon or isn't running Ghost, isn't running Cold-Blooded, or some combination of those three. So your stealth doesn't really make a huge difference. I'm aware of the fact that having one player on your squad go full stealth is fairly handy even if the rest of the squad isn't, but in all honesty, the Kilo doesn't necessarily need to be stealthed. You need to shoot first. You need to see them first, and you just need to start shooting first so you can get that vertical recoil under control and get those accurate shots. So, sacrificing one of these attachments in favor of a suppressor, generally speaking, really hurts your ability to support your team at long range with either covering fire, suppressive fire, or straight up murder fire. This is ultimately why I don't use a silencer on the Kilo. This doesn't mean you shouldn't ever use a silencer on the Kilo, nor should you never use a silencer or extend the barrel of other guns. I'll deal with those when I get to them in different videos, but for the Kilo, it just doesn't need it. The components here I personally find more helpful in more situations than a longer barrel or suppression. The exception to this rule is when I'm running solo Warzone, in which case I generally run my core setup, which is this right here, the Whisper Barrel, Commando 4 grip 50 round mags, stippled grip tape, and the 1 megawatt laser. Now, I use the Whisper Barrel in solo because it's just you can run whatever perks you want. You can actually utilize the Whisper Barrel's suppression to its full capacity because you are alone. And again, the Kilo wants to hit first because it really makes a huge difference in whether or not it wins or loses, so the stealth aspect really does help a lot in that situation. And in solo Warzone, you don't really encounter 4, 5, 6 possible targets, depending on what squad you're running with, but you're generally going to be seeing 1, maybe 2 people. It's very rare that you find yourself attacked by 3 different separate players in solo Warzone. It doesn't happen that often. 50 round mags is often enough in solo Warzone to take care of whatever problems you need. Not only your original target of whoever you were originally shooting at, but if somebody sees bullets flying or hears the opponent shooting, which is pretty common, then they come running over and you still have enough ammo to kill them afterwards. So 50 round mags I do consider still very important for solo Warzone. The Whisper Barrel, of course, I just went over. The 1 megawatt laser is kind of an extra attachment, the Commando 4 grip I've got on here, because it is really the only attachment that you need to completely control the Kilo's recoil. I only used the Merc 4 grip in the Warzone squad and ground war build because it needed to counterbalance the loss of vertical recoil control from no stock, but since we're not using no stock in the core/solo Warzone build, the Commando 4 grip will get you all of the recoil control you need, both horizontal and vertical. The stippled grip tape is a very specifically chosen attachment to help sprint to fire speed. When you're playing core, you often will be playing objective-based modes, unless you're somebody who plays exclusively deathmatch or kill confirmed. Forgot the name of it for a moment there. You're really not going to be always necessarily moving slowly. I know a lot of people tend to play slower and or camp in objective-based modes, but there is always a point in a match where somebody is attacking an objective that you need to be defending or vice versa, and you need to get there quick. A bomb is planted, you need to get to the hard point, etc. This domination flag is being taken. If you play any objective-based modes, you know what I'm talking about, and sometimes you just need to book it. And the stippled grip tape does really make a difference in being able to ADS in time to attack the threat before the threat can start attacking you. Again, it's all about getting that first bullet in, and the stippled grip tape really helps there. The 1 megawatt laser, like I said earlier, was a bonus attachment that I had a spare slot for, and I put the 1 megawatt laser on specifically to help the close quarters combat of the Kilo. The Kilo has a little bit of problem with close quarters combat because unlike most other assault rifles available to you in the game, The Kilo does not have a shorter barrel that increases hipfire. It just doesn't. It has two longer barrels that decrease hipfire, and the Whisper barrel, which doesn't care at all. So you have to find your different ways of getting some hipfire accuracy, but it prevents the Kilo from specializing in it. But because the Kilo doesn't really need a whole lot in terms of recoil control, often you have a spare slot like this, where you can slap on Mark IV grip, 1 megawatt laser. I only attached it to really help with close quarters fights, because core maps, the smaller maps, in general, hardcore or core, generally have more indoor locations, or at least a roughly equivalent amount of indoor locations to outdoor locations, and there are times where hip firing is fairly common, depending on how you play and what map you're on. And the 1 megawatt laser really can help make a difference if your opponent is either a very inaccurate shotgunner, or somebody with, again, a badly spec'd SMG will probably lose to you with just the 1 megawatt laser. The only reason I didn't go with a 5 megawatt laser is because that really defeats the point of the Whisper barrel. If you choose, as a rush player, say, to not use the Whisper barrel and to go with the 5 megawatt laser, that's perfectly fine. What you would replace the Whisper barrel with, I really couldn't tell you. Maybe an optic, possibly, but I don't really see why a rush player would need an optic. If I had to make a specific recommendation, I would say possibly fast melee, but it really is up to you if you are a rush player on core. This is just how I typically play the Kilo on core and in solo Warzone. On hardcore, it's a completely different story. I actually run the very exciting 12 gauge Deputy shotgun. I'm actually going to discuss this first, because it's definitely the standout point of interest on this build. The reason I use the 12 gauge Deputy in hardcore is because I do use an extended barrel on the Kilo, which completely defeats its ability to hipfire. As such, I needed to find some new way of dealing with close-range threats, and the 12 gauge Deputy, being technically a separate gun and not affected by the hipfire accuracy of the Kilo 141, was the logical choice here, and it has saved my life a whole lot in hardcore, and it's very effective at defeating opponents in hardcore. If you've tried the 12 gauge Deputy in core and weren't impressed, well, try it in hardcore. It's quite a difference. The reason why I chose to extend the barrel of the Kilo in hardcore as opposed to the other modes people typically extend it on is because at the close to medium range, the Kilo can in fact kill people in hardcore with a single headshot, which is really the Kilo's only possible method of one-shot killing anyone in any mode. Therefore, extending the range of your medium to close range becomes quite significant. Now, I chose the SOCOM rather than the Prowler barrel for a simple reason of speed. I found that the Prowler barrel was a little bit too slow for my personal playstyle in terms of ADS, and especially, again, I hate harping on this, but it's really important you take away at least this about the Kilo. Kilo needs to shoot first. So the ADS speed was more important to me than the increased range that the Prowler provided. I chose specifically the hollow sight because it is a 1.5 times zoom. I didn't want to just rely on iron sights, although you absolutely can if you really like the Kilo iron sights. The close quarter stock, again, it's all about... The close quarter stock and the stippled grip tape, honestly, are here just to increase that ADS speed even more. If you were really interested in doing so, although this is quite a bit risky, you could drop either the close quarter stock, the stippled grip tape, or even the combat hollow sight for the tac laser, and while I have personally experimented with this, I find that it gives me away too often in hardcore, where you don't really normally have to worry about being seen because there is no constant radar, and even if UAVs and personal radars are very common, often there's so much other things that an enemy player is worrying about that they still might not necessarily be paying enough attention to their radar, or they're paying too much attention to it. I've never particularly had a problem not running a suppressor in hardcore for that reason, but I feel like the tac laser really takes away my potential advantage of the opponent paying too much attention to their radar by drawing attention to me. It still can work, but I've just found that there were times where I knew for a fact that they only knew I was there because of my tac laser, and that got me killed. So I don't play it on hardcore, at least not with the Kilo. But if you are more comfortable with it, especially in the usage of either a higher scope or even just the hollow sight, that's perfectly acceptable. Just be aware of where and when you're pointing that laser. Finally, to cap off the particular report, we have the least favorite mode for me to use the Kilo in, which is the CDL. Now, the reason why I hate using the Kilo in the CDL is because its main flaw, which would be its low damage output, generally requires it to shoot first, as I've been harping on. I apologize. But in CDL, there is absolutely no suppressors allowed, hipfire increasing weapons are completely banned, and it just becomes much more difficult to get that necessary jump on your enemy in the CDL, and so the Kilo has a really hard time in the CDL modes. But if you absolutely must take the Kilo into the CDL, this is what I run. And this was tested throughout various CDL matches. Some adjustments were made, but ultimately this is what I came up with. Now, obviously, because we really have our ability to increase hipfire taken completely away, since the only hipfire boosting attachment that is available to the Kilo in CDL is no stock, which has its own downsides, I decided that the best option for the Kilo was to go whole hog into the distance game and try to shoot opponents from longer range with sustained fire. This generally works fairly well, although this does require you to play very defensively with the Kilo, and this is the only mode I would say that you really shouldn't be playing a rush game with the Kilo. So if you're a rush player looking to play the CDL, don't use the Kilo. It just will not work out. The Commando 4 grip and the SOCOM barrel are really there to help you with that longer range game. The hollow sight, again, is a personal preference. I just found that I didn't need a 3 times or higher scope that often in the CDL, although for some maps there are times where I wished I had it. So that becomes down to, again, a personal preference. I just valued the ADS speed more than the 3 times-ish zoom. 50 round mags, because again, you're looking at higher health pools, you're looking at a potential 5 to 6 opponents coming at you at any given time in the right modes, such as hardpoint, for instance, again. So the 50 round mags really do become important and do actually do quite a lot of damage to an opposing team in CDL. Stippled grip tape, again, you might need to run. The sprint to fire can really save your life here. It's basically just a longer range unsuppressed version of the core build, which is basically how you should be playing the CDL with the Kilo anyways. With that being stated, this is generally how I run a lot of my Kilo setups. So, generally speaking, to close out the report, the Kilo's only issue as a weapon is its low damage output, which is generated by a combination of its slightly smaller ammo, but more particularly by its really slow firing rate. This is fine as long as you get the jump on your opponent, which generally speaking involves either seeing them first or being relatively stealthy. The Kilo can do both relatively well. The Kilo really wants sustained fire, so the Kilo 141 operates best in ground war and war zone. However, it serves pretty well in core. Where I would recommend you use it the least would be hardcore, and most definitely don't use it in the CDL unless you are obsessed with the Kilo. With that being said, thank you all very much for listening and or watching, and I hope you have a great 24 hours. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. If not, ignore me. Thank you very much.